Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker is. Studebaker is.
Ladies and gentlemen, managers.
Thank you, my friend. All right. Thank you. Well, thanks, Andy, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks for your patience with the sound flaws there. But, yeah, my name is Matt Anderson, Curator of Transportation at Henry Ford. I'm delighted to be invited back here again. It's always a pleasure to be at the Studebaker National Museum with the great team, the fantastic collection here. It's an honor to be a part of the Concours at Kopsche, and I'm glad to be a part of the speaker series again this year. But, yeah, to Andy's point, auto racing in the United States has a very long history. There is that joke about the first race being when they built the second car. In truth, the first real formal organized race in the U.S. took place in November of 1895. It was about a 45-mile round-trip race between Chicago and Evanston, Illinois. And I think something like 6 cars entered and 2 of them managed to finish. But the winner was an American-built car, though. So we got that going for us there. But the first big international automobile race held in the United States took place on Long Island, the Vanderbilt Cup. And it brought in the top racers from Europe and some of the best racers in the United States as well. And the event that kind of put the Vanderbilt on the map, certainly by U.S. standards, occurred in 1908 when the car you see up there, Old 16, a 1906 Locomobile, won the race. American driver, American car, the first American car to win this big international race, which kind of proved that our cars were now every bit as good as those coming from overseas. And that car is now in the collections of the Henry Ford, one of our absolute treasures. But that's the story we're going to tell, not just 1908, but we're going to take a look at the Vanderbilt Cup in general, the history of this race, how it was organized, how it was run. And as Andy had mentioned, the person behind it is right here, William K. Vanderbilt Jr., who was a great-grandson of the steamboat and railroad magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt. Cornelius Vanderbilt founded the New York Central Railroad, including the famous water-level route from New York City to Chicago, which passed just a few blocks south of where we are right now through South Bend on its way between those two towns. Willie K, as he was known, he of course had both the time and, more importantly perhaps, the money to pursue auto racing seriously. It very much at the turn of the 20th century was a wealthy person's sport. I think you could probably make the argument that it's still a wealthy person's sport today, certainly in sports car racing and sort of some of the higher echelons of automotive racing, but very much the case at the turn of the 20th century. Willie K had organized the National Automobile Racing Association. He even won a hill climb race himself at Newport, Rhode Island in 1901. He toured Europe shortly after that and set speed records over there, raced in multiple events, and kind of came back to the U.S. inspired and determined to organize a road race on his native Long Island. And we'll take a look here. I'm sure all of you are familiar, but in the red circle there is Long Island, which is located at the foot of New York State. In fact, the western end basically forms part of the entrance to New York Harbor. That's where Brooklyn, Queens, those boroughs of Manhattan, or of New York City, I should say, are located. And then you see the eastern tip goes all the way just about to the border between Connecticut and Rhode Island. Today, it's very heavily suburbanized, but at the time, it was really only the western end of the island that had been heavily suburbanized as a part of the New York metropolis. The island's eastern tip at that time was still rather rural and bucolic, to be honest with you. In between the eastern and western tip lay the enclaves and the homes of some of the wealthiest families in the United States, including, of course, the Vanderbilts. And here's a drawing from the Henry Ford's collection here, made circa 1845 of Hempstead in Long Island. And granted, we're talking about a period of time about 60 years later, but still the character of the island had not changed too much at that time, at least part of the island, or that part of the island. Willie K worked the refs, as it were, worked the field, his neighbors, and gathered support for his proposed race, trying to get his own sort of social peers, shall we say, on board, because if the wealthy families were in, he figured he could make the thing happen fairly easily. He coordinated as well with the newly formed American Automobile Association. But the Long Island residents, the year-round residents, not the wealthy summer folks there, kind of pushed back on the idea. And the loudest critics were actually farmers. They were upset with the idea of public roads being used for what was, again, a rich person's sport, essentially so. And they thought that if they're paying taxes for these roads, they should be open to the public for regular travel at all times of the year. They shouldn't be closed for something as silly as motor racing. But the press had its own concerns in addition to the farmers. The press was more concerned about spectator crowd control than about safety. And as it would turn out, those were some rather prescient concerns. But we'll talk about that in a few moments. Nevertheless, Willie Kay's influence, his social status, and his wealth, frankly, carried the day, and he was able to arrange the inaugural Vanderbilt Cup race, scheduling it for the fall of 1904. And indeed, it's appropriate that we're here talking about this race in October, because that is when most of these races took place, so just this time of year. And of course, you can't have a big race without having a big prize, so Mr. Vanderbilt commissioned a special silver cup from Tiffany & Company. The cup itself stood about 2 feet tall with a capacity of 10.5 gallons, if you want to think of it that way. Featured, modest though he is, Mr. Vanderbilt made sure to include himself on the cup there. That's him at the wheel of his Mercedes. And then on the other side, his plan was that the names of the winners of each race would be added as the years go by. So a fairly elaborate trophy, modest compared to the Borg-Warner trophy perhaps, where they have the whole face on there in addition to the name, but something in a similar spirit. And incidentally, the cup still survives to this day, though now it is in the collections of the Smithsonian Museum of American History. And you can go onto their webpage and see a photo of it as it appears. I'm not sure that it's currently on display. I know we've borrowed it in the past at the Henry Ford, and it's traveled farther exhibits, so it does still get around. But it's good to know that this trophy still survives, perhaps the ultimate artifact from the competition. We're looking here at a picture of Edward Hawley in his number 8 Mercedes at the very first race in 1904. And the course for the first race was 30.24 miles of dirt roads right through the center of Long Island. And drivers would make 10 laps around a roughly triangular-shaped circuit, including 1.8 miles of what they called control points on each lap. And the control points would be deducted the distance, that 1.8 miles, leaving the race's overall distance of about 284.4 miles. And it was Willie K. Vanderbilt himself who personally waved the flag that started the first race at 6 o'clock in the morning on October 8th, 1904. And I mentioned those control points. The 1904 course passed through populated areas in Hicksville and Hempstead, and officials required every car to stop at control points in those two areas, just for safety's sake, because they were populated areas. Every car would carry a box on it like this, and when the car pulled into the control point, an official there would write down the arrival time of the car and then the departure time when it was set back out onto the field. So the time you spent sitting in the control point didn't count against you, if that makes sense, for your total racing time. And this is an original. Again, this is in the collections of the Henry Ford. We have this in our racing display right now over in Dearborn. And mentioned at the race's end, your control time would be subtracted and the actual lapse time of your finish would be calculated from that. One of the issues with racing on public roadways, which was frankly a part of the race's appeal, the fact that there were these broad open avenues where people could stand up, watch the race in person without having to pay to go into grandstand. But the trade-off was there were considerable dangers. The 1904 course actually crossed the Long Island Railroad not once, not twice, but 4 times. And only one of those crossings was actually separated by a bridge. So there were flagmen posted by the railroad and by racing officials at each crossing to warn racers when a train was approaching. But we have to imagine that the temptation to ignore those warnings must have been pretty strong. And this illustration made by a French artist in 1904 kind of illustrates the danger that would have happened there. But artistic license aside, those crossings were real. We're looking here at Hicksville on the race course, and you see the locomotive there on the left-hand side, the crossing gates down as the train goes by. And the first race was indeed marred by tragedy. On just the second lap of the race, American driver George Orentz Jr., who we see in this photo here, he attempted to make a turn in Queens with a flat tire on his Mercedes. The front wheel buckled under him, and the 2,000-pound car rolled over onto Orentz and his riding mechanic, Carl Menzel. A photo of the aftermath of the accident. Unfortunately, Menzel died at the scene from severe head injuries. Orentz himself was seriously injured, but after several weeks he was able to recover, though he did effectively retire from racing after this crash. I'm not so sure if it was because of the extent of his injuries or just the fear that he had that something much worse could happen and worried to continue his career. And we see here Herbert Lytle in the number 6 Pope Toledo in the 1904 race. He finished third, which was impressive enough, but he actually has a kind of a bigger spot in American racing history. 7 years after the first Vanderbilt Cup, Lytle went down to Indianapolis to compete in Carl Fisher's new 500-mile sweepstakes. He finished 32nd there in that race in 1911 because of an accident, but regardless of whether he finished that race or not, Lytle holds the record of being the only individual to race in both the very first Vanderbilt Cup and the very first Indianapolis 500. So his place in history, I think, is secure. We're looking at George Heath's Panhard here. Now, he beat 17 other entrants in 1904 from the U.S., from Germany, from Italy, and from France to win the very first Vanderbilt Cup race. Now, he was an American driver, but his car was built in France, a Panhard, as we mentioned, and finished in a total time of 6 hours, 56 minutes, 45 seconds, which works out to an average race speed of about 52.2 miles an hour, which is pretty fast for 1904. Fittingly, Heath had been born on Long Island, though by 1904 he was actually living in Paris as an American expatriate. The plan had been to let all the running cars race to the finish. Everyone would get their chance to go across the finish line. But after Heath crossed the line here, in fact, probably just moments after this photo was taken, the crowd swarmed onto the track, kind of cheering, grabbing at him, celebrating. And it just got to be too dangerous. So officials shut the race right then and there. So we don't really know officially the times that the other drivers would have finished. The Vanderbilt Cup would return the next year, October 14th, 1905. The course was modified to a length of 28.3 miles per lap, and the total length was set at 10 laps. The control points of 1904 were eliminated this time, and they also removed several sharp corners just to encourage higher speed and reduce the risk of accident. This time there were 19 cars from the U.S. and Europe that competed before a crowd that was estimated at over 100,000 people along the entire race course. And again, you didn't have to pay. There were some grandstands near the start-finish line, the premium seats, if you will, which you would pay an admission to see. But otherwise, you were welcome to stand up anywhere along that course and just watch the race for free. The grandstand and the press box in 1905 were placed at Mineola, which is about 12 miles east of Queens. And the fellow there in the, I think I've got a pointer here. Yeah, fellow right there in the goggles, that's Willie Kay there, standing, waiting for the race to begin. Contestants for 1905 included the Swiss-American driver Louis Chevrolet, who was driving a Fiat that year. He broke his axle on lap 7, wasn't able to finish the race, but he would return to the Vanderbilt to race again in 1908, 1909, and 1910. In fact, he survived a serious crash in the 1910 race. It was the following year, in 1911, that Chevrolet partnered with Billy Durant to form the car company that bears his name. And I think it's fair to say that today, Chevrolet's is the best name remembered out of the entire Vanderbilt Cup experience. Probably even better remembered than the Vanderbilt name at this point. And there's George Heath again. He, of course, returned to defend his title. He actually finished second, though, in 1905, just 3 minutes, 42 seconds behind the leader. And who was the leader? Victor Hermé from France, who earned the overall win against Heath. Hermé's French-made Dirac averaged about 61.5 miles an hour that year. And as had been done in 1905, the 1906 race was actually preceded by an American elimination trial. So we moved ahead to 1906. And to determine which American cars are going to compete against these European vehicles, they held essentially a qualifying race to see which cars could best stand on the field. And 12 cars competed in the qualifying race there. And it was a 297-mile event, which reportedly attracted a larger crowd than even the 1905 Vanderbilt main event. So the qualifying now had gotten bigger even than the race itself of the previous year. Oldsmobile, Pope Toledo, Thomas, Maxwell, Haynes, and Locomobile were among the American marques represented. Joe Tracy and his riding mechanic Al Poole attempted to qualify in a 90-horsepower Locomobile built by the company at a reported cost of $20,000, and this is 1906 dollars. So $20,000 then works out to well over $650,000 today. So very expensive, purpose-built racing vehicle. Tracy and Poole battled with a Thomas Flyer during the qualifying race, but after the final lap, they crossed the finish line with a decisive lead, and Locomobile was quick to capitalize on just the elimination trial win here in various advertisements like the one we see here, made in November of 1906. Locomobile, the greatest American car, nothing subtle about that. Here's a typical shot along the race course in 1908 here. This is Krug's East Williston Hotel. And you see the throngs of people everywhere, not just on the streets, but there are folks up sitting on top of the second story of that hotel porch there. In fact, the photo itself, it's hard to tell from this point, but I believe it was taken from a telephone pole. There were some press reporters and photographers who actually climbed up in the poles to get a better view to capture some of these panoramic photos. The 1906 Vanderbilt Cup race proper featured a 29.7-mile course this time, with portions rerouted to avoid a newly built trolley line. Hairpin turns and hills were added to the race this time to give it more challenge, and there were 17 cars and driver-mechanic teams that entered. More than 200,000 people this time watched the main event, which was held on October 6th of 1906. As I say, this photo gives you a sense of the crowds and, frankly, the overall chaos. We're looking here at Joe Tracy and Al Poole in their number 9 locomobile. They covered the 297 miles in about 5 hours, 41 minutes, an average race speed of about 52.3 miles an hour. Only good enough for a 10th place finish, though, in 1906. The 1906 Vanderbilt Cup race would, in fact, be Tracy's last. He retired shortly thereafter, but the car will return, as we'll find out here soon. Here we look at Louis Wagner and his number 10 Dirac. He and his mechanic Louis Vevey took the checkered flag in 1906 in that car, and they averaged 61.4 miles an hour, so close to 10 miles an hour faster than the average speed set by Tracy and Poole. And this is just a great photo here of the car crossing the line here. This is the number 18 De Dietrich by Arthur DeRay at the wheel, or him driving. Purportedly, the 1906 Vanderbilt Cup was the first time in the United States that a checkered flag had been used to end an automobile race. So I think it's fair to say the checkered flag is the most iconic element of all of motorsport. And in the U.S., at least, it got its start right here at the Vanderbilt Cup, fittingly enough. By the way, DeRay finished in 3rd place that year, so there would have been 2 finishers ahead of him already. There were concerns about safety from the very start. We talked about the railroad crossings, the public standing right there on the roads and the shoulders of the roads. So concerns not just for the safety of the drivers, but also for spectators. But Willie K. Vanderbilt always kind of poo-pooed any concerns about safety, and he replied to them with this quote here: "The common sense of the American people will help make this thing a success." And I hope I'm not going out on a limb here when I say I don't think relying on the common sense of the general public has ever turned out well in anything in the history of all time. So perhaps he was a little too optimistic in that, and indeed he was, as we'll find out, unfortunately. This is a Mercedes driven by Camille Janazzi of Belgium at the Vanderbilt Cup race in 1906, and some lessons were learned from previous races. We're looking here at 1906. Some safety modifications had been made for that year, but unfortunately not enough. There were some hastily built fences. You can see what's essentially chicken wire and poles here for fences along this area here. But nevertheless, people managed to either tear down the fences, climb over them, get around them one way or another. Crowds broke through, got too close, and of course other areas had no fencing whatsoever. They were just wide open from the start. And there was a spectator by the name of Kurt Gruner who got too close to the action in 1906 and was actually hit and killed by one of the competitor cars. As you might imagine, the press jumped all over the story, and after a rash of critical newspaper coverage and editorials, officials canceled the Vanderbilt Cup for 1907 until they could get a better handle on the situation. This did not sit well with Willie K. Vanderbilt, as you can imagine. He was determined to be able to save his race and bring it back for 1908, so he actually organized a company to build what would become a closed, or largely closed, course for the race, but had to have some purpose during the rest of the year. So we organized a company to build what became the Long Island Motor Parkway. We see construction here between 1907 and 1908 as they're grading and putting down the substrate gravel, and looks like some concrete paving going in the background there. This would be one of the world's first limited access automobile roadways, complete with grade separations, guardrails, banked turns, and reinforced concrete roadbed, everything we associate with the interstate highways that we drive on today. Vanderbilt's company eventually constructed about 45 miles of roadway between Queens and Lake Ronkonkoma at a cost of about $6 million, a lot of money in 1907. And here's what they ended up with for the race course for 1908. The Parkway's first section was completed in time to be a part of the course here. And in every respect, of course, the new roadway, the new Long Island Motor Parkway, improved on the original track, the original open public roads, in every respect. And you get a sense of the improved construction along here in the front. And there's the parkway down here. There's the grandstand. The start and finish line would be here. And then the whole course, again, follows this circuit around here. We're looking at one of those beautiful bridges on the Long Island Parkway here, eliminating intersections with roads and railroads, and those guardrails as well, which helped to some extent keep back spectators. The bridges also provided a safer spot for folks to watch and a unique angle of the action as well, so they had that going for them too. But nevertheless, the Parkway, even for all the money, time, and effort invested in it, constituted less than half of the 1908 race course, so it was better, but certainly not perfect. The course for 1908 was 23.46 miles and included 9 miles on the new Parkway, as we just hinted at, and then 14.46 miles of traditional open public roads. 17 cars, including 6 foreign makes, competed that year, and the race was held on October 24th, 1908. And crowds this year were estimated at 250,000, so they just keep growing from about, well, just under 100,000 the first year to over 100,000 to 200,000, now we're up to 250,000. There was another innovation for 1908. There was a series of supply pits for the cars and the racers that were placed in front of the grandstand at the Hempstead Plains. Now, interestingly, according to the rules, only the driver and the mechanic in the car were allowed to actually touch any of the supplies. About the best the pit crew could do was kind of pass along the tires, but the driver and the mechanic would have to actually change the tires, replace the tires, fill the fuel, whatever it might be. So it wasn't a crew in the sense we think of today at a modern motor race. But nevertheless, this is probably the first use, certainly in the United States, of racing pits in a competition like this. And the idea behind these pits wasn't so much to protect the crew down there or keep them out of the roadway. The idea was that it would get them down below the view, the eye line of the spectators sitting in the grandstand. You see the grandstand on the other side. There would have been one right on the other side as well. Imagine folks sitting down in the first couple of rows. They might not be able to see through the crew if they were staged there at ground level, so they put them down into pits, which is kind of funny because now people pay a premium to be able to be sitting right next to the pit crew and watch the crew do all of the work. Of course, the crew far different than it was now in terms of the speed, the efficiency, and the work they do, so it's frankly more interesting to watch a modern pit crew than it probably would have been to watch this crew at the time. But even though they're not below ground anymore, obviously the term pit has survived in racing. It's still used today to describe the area where the mechanics and the crew that service the cars are stationed at a racetrack. We're looking here at one of the most scenic locations on the race here. We're looking at an American driver, E.J. Kilpatrick, piloting a French-built number 9 Hotchkiss with his riding mechanic, Gustave Ken. Now, this car's clutch broke on lap 3, so the race was over rather quickly in the grand scheme of things, but not before they were photographed in this fantastic location. This is called the Jericho Turn, named for its location near the small community of Jericho on Long Island, about 29 miles east of Manhattan. But this photo also gives you a sense of the issue of crowd control and how dangerous it is. For all the work that was done for the fencing in certain parts of the track, for the grade separations of the motor parkway, there was still many, many miles where people were just sitting and standing either right on the side of the roadway or in fact sometimes right in the roadway, which is how incidents like the strike in 1906 happened. Another shot, same location on the Jericho Turn. This time we're looking at driver George Robertson and his riding mechanic Glenn Etheridge. And they are driving locomobile, the same locomobile which Joe Tracy had driven 2 years earlier in 1906, and with which they had won the Vanderbilt qualifying race that year, though not the Cup itself. The car was renumbered 16 for the 1908 race and very quickly was given the nickname Old 16. And this was a car that was all engine with very little bodywork. It's 990 cubic inches, believe it or not. Robertson handled the driving, and Etheridge actually worked an air pump because the gas tank with the fuel lines weren't pressurized, so he's got to pump air into it to keep fuel flowing into the engine. And he also operated plungers that pumped oil into the engine, so a lot of manual labor involved in operating this car. Locomobile had learned their lesson from 1906, where they could have probably finished much better. The problem was that Joe Tracy was dealing with a number of flat tires in the 1906 race, which slowed him down. So Locomobile put improved tires and, big breakthrough here, demountable rims on Old 16 for the 1908 race, so they didn't have to replace the whole tire itself. They could just loosen the rim, pull it off, and put a new rim, new tire already fitted on there. Much faster for the tire changes. And here we see Willie K. Vanderbilt himself off to the left here with Old 16. Tires nearly did in Old 16 in 1908, despite the improved demountable rims. Robertson and Etheridge suffered a flat on the final lap, and they scrambled to change it out, and they were down to just one spare tire left at the time. But they managed to get it done. They finished the race, crossed the finish line just 1 minute and 48 seconds ahead of their nearest competitor, which was the number 6 Asota, driven by Herb Lytle, who we talked about earlier, driving in the first Vanderbilt and the first Indy 500. We should note there was a second locomobile that actually raced in 1908 as well. It was the number 1 car, which was driven by Jim Florida, but he finished 3rd place, whereas Old 16 took the checkered flag. And not surprisingly, the locomobile was very quick to promote their victory in the Vanderbilt Cup. This advertisement is from Harper's Weekly in 1909 there, and you see here it calls out the car's average racing speed, 64.4 miles an hour, or more than a mile a minute. It also highlighted the car's durability under the competition's extreme conditions. In fact, it says that the Vanderbilt Cup was a supreme test under which only a car of perfect design and material integrity could win. One of my favorite notes about this is just noted here in the bottom of the paragraph, but it says here that for those wishing they could send in 10 cents and receive a colored poster of the car suitable for framing. Now, Old 16's victory in 1908 is one of several things that happened in that specific year that kind of marked 1908 as a watershed for the American automotive industry. Certainly, Old 16's victory proved that American cars were every bit as well built, well designed, and powerful as their European counterparts. But it was just one event of that watershed year. 1908 was the year that Billy Durant formed General Motors. It was the year that Cadillac won the Dewar Prize in Britain when they brought 3 Cadillacs over to England and then took them all apart, mixed and matched the parts, reassembled them, and lo and behold, they had 3 perfectly functioning cars, proving the precision of Henry Leland's innovative interchangeable parts. 1908 was also the year that a Buffalo, New York-built Thomas Flyer won the New York to Paris race. And not incidentally, 1908, also the year that Henry Ford introduced the Model T, which would prove its own things for the value of interchangeable parts. For 1909, there were changes in terms of the specifications for Vanderbilt Cup cars. They were reduced now to a cubic inch displacement of no more than 610. Compare that to the 990 of Old 16, so a considerable cut in displacement. The race course itself was moved on to 5 miles of parkway and about 7.5 miles of public roads. This time, Fiat of Italy was the only foreign company to come over and send a car for the race. The checkered flag that year went to this man right here, Harry Grant, in a chain-driven Alco, dubbed the Black Beast. His average race speed, 62.8 miles an hour. Rather astonishing to think even in 1909, not just a racing car, but any car, using a chain drive, but such was the case. And Grant and the Black Beast returned for the 1910 Vanderbilt Cup race. George Robertson, who of course had won in 1908, was back again, as thought to be a favorite perhaps for the 1910 race, though he never actually made it into the race. During pre-race promotional activities, George Robertson was asked by a newspaper reporter if the reporter could be taken for a ride around the race course and see what it was like firsthand. So Robertson was happy to oblige, but racing drivers being racing drivers, I'm sure he leaned a little heavy on the throttle. The reporter panicked, kind of grabbed at Robinson. He lost control of the car and unfortunately crashed and got some pretty serious arm injuries that he did recover from. He did heal, but obviously he was out of the race. He wasn't able to compete in 1910 until that arm healed. Grant did appear, however, Harry Grant that we've talked about, alongside 25 other cars and in front of, this time, 300,000 spectators to take on the course, which by this time had been cut down to 12.5 miles. Grant repeated his victory with the Black Beast, as he had done the year before. This time his average speed was 65.2 miles an hour. Sadly, in 1910, not one but 2 riding mechanics were killed in the race. Charles Miller, who was riding with Louis Chevrolet, who we talked about earlier, and then Matthew Bacon. They were both killed in separate incidents. So getting safer for the spectators, but not so much for the participants, the riding mechanicians and drivers. And the concerns about those deaths, again, echoed through the columns of newspapers in the greater New York area. Another illustration that's perfect for this time of year. Not too subtle, again, in making the point about the death stalking and surrounding the Vanderbilt Cup. And Long Island residents, basically, because of complaints about safety and these recent deaths, forced the Vanderbilt Cup to relocate for the 1911 season. And relocate fairly far they did. They moved to Savannah, Georgia, hosted the event on November 27th, so also a little later in the year for the 1911 race. And this year it was Ralph Mulford who raced to victory in the American-built Lozier, who we see here, the number 8 car. And he beat 13 other drivers, averaged 74.1 miles per hour over a 17-lap, 17-mile course. Milwaukee, Wisconsin hosted the race in 1912. This time it was just 7.8 miles long, and the field was just 8 cars. Ralph De Palma took the prize that year in a Mercedes, and he had an average race speed of 69 miles an hour. There was no race in 1913, but then for 1914, the Vanderbilt Cup headed west to Santa Monica, California, near Los Angeles. De Palma returns to win again with another Mercedes, beating a field that included Barney Oldfield, one of the great original American racers, in a close match that saw De Palma average 75.5 miles an hour. And then it moves just a little further north in California for 1915 to San Francisco, where it tied in with the Panama Pacific International Exposition, sort of a World's Fair that was held to celebrate the then recent opening of the Panama Canal. The 3.8-mile course for 1915 circled the Palace of Fine Arts on the fairgrounds, which we're looking at here. Oh, we're looking at the ferry building, in San Francisco here. 30 cars entered that year with a new 450 cubic inch engine limit. So they put a permanent top-end limit on all engine size for the race that year. So it effectively became kind of like a modern NASCAR stock car race where everybody built a car to identical specifications. You didn't see the kind of variety that you did even 3 or 4 years earlier in the Vanderbilt Cup, which probably took away some of the excitement and certainly some of the speed. 30 cars entered, and the winning car was driven by Dario Resta, a Peugeot, which averaged 66.4 miles an hour, so considerably slower than the 70-plus that Ralph De Palma had done the year before. The race returned to Santa Monica, California for what would become its final year in 1916. 19 cars that year, and Dario Resta actually repeated his win with the very same Peugeot in 1916, but this time his average speed, 87 miles an hour, so considerably better than what he had done the year before. And after 1916, any number of factors conspired to bring an end to the Vanderbilt Cup, the obvious one being World War I, which claimed many of the best European drivers by that time already. Also, the Vanderbilt Cup had been kind of outshone by purpose-built racetracks. Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which had opened in 1909, being the preeminent example. And not only were those safer for drivers and for spectators alike, racing promoters also realized if you can control the crowd in a grandstand setting like that, you can charge everyone to see the race. Nobody gets to watch for free anymore. And there was also the rise of AAA, or the American Automobile Association, beginning to sanction more and more automobile races, and the Vanderbilt Cup came to be seen as an outside, unprofessional kind of outlaw race, we would call it today, not to be confused with the modern world of outlaws, which kind of has its origins in the same way, believe it or not. But because of that, the Vanderbilt Cup essentially was just becoming not profitable anymore and not worth holding. Willie K. Vanderbilt, though, he had made his mark nevertheless and given the United States its first great automobile race, its first signature motorsport competition. So certainly the Vanderbilt Cup's legacy was secured. And just, I've been throwing out these figures throughout the presentation, but this is a chart to give you a sense of speed and horsepower on the cars over the years there. And you can see the blue line is horsepower, red line is speed. Speed, just not surprisingly, generally trending upward over the years. Horsepower, you can see when they put in those displacement limits on the engines, how it will drop, and then when they raise the limit, it'll shoot up rather quickly there, especially 1912, 1913, 14, in that range. But generally speaking, the trend is ever upward on that, as you would expect. Now, believe it or not, 20 years after the last Vanderbilt Cup, in 1936, the idea was revived by who else but George Vanderbilt III, who we see there passing the trophy, who is a nephew of Willie K. Vanderbilt. And this time he revived it on Roosevelt Raceway at Westbury, New York, Roosevelt Raceway near Roosevelt Airport, where, interestingly, our friend Charles Lindbergh took off to fly to Paris in 1927, so it would have been, 9 years before this race. But nevertheless, the Roosevelt Raceway was on Long Island, so the Vanderbilt Cup's kind of returning to its original home. This time it's a 300-mile race, and it actually attracted mostly European talent, and it was an Italian driver by the name of Tazio Nuvolari who won the inaugural race, in an Alfa Romeo, appropriately enough. Bernard Rosenmeyer earned the following year's win with a German-built Auto Union, which is a predecessor to our modern Audi company. Crowds, unfortunately, were light at both of the races due to relatively slow speeds compared to the glory days, the turn of the 20th century. but also because of the lack of American drivers. American drivers at this time were focused on the Indianapolis 500 or their own championship series car races versus the foreign road racing circuits had kind of taken over here in the United States, particularly oval track circuits. The revival lasted just 2 years, 1936, 1937. We're looking here just a couple of years later, and there are a couple of interesting figures in this photo here. This was taken at the New York Antique Auto Show of 1948. This is the presentation of the grand prize. So a few years after the 1908 Vanderbilt Cup race, foundry owner Joe Sessions, who had actually made some of the castings for the old 16 race car, managed to convince Locomobile to sell him the car. Locomobile figured they had won the race, they had gotten all this publicity out of it, the car was of no use to them anymore, so they were happy to sell him this vehicle. Sessions held on to it until he passed away in 1941, and then Joe Tracy, who had driven the car back in 1906, managed to arrange a sale from Sessions' widow to the illustrator Peter Helk, who illustrated many, many great volumes on automotive history from the 40s into the 50s and beyond. And we have Helk here photographed receiving the grand prize for Old 16, which he brought to the show. He won the top honors. And his prize, I imagine it's a little tongue-in-cheek, his own miniature replica of the Vanderbilt Cup there. So the original was about 10.5 gallons. This looks like it might hold a shot of tequila, and that's about it. But he had the car. I'm sure he wasn't too disappointed to get a small trophy for it. And the other fellow here who I wanted to mention, well, two other people here. First of all, back here, this is actually Joe Tracy. So obviously looking a little older than he did in 1906, but still alive and well. I'm sure happy to have been there to see the Old 16 win the prize at the New York Antique Auto Show. And the other fellow over here is a name you've actually probably seen in the bottom here pop up with several of these photos. This is Henry Austin Clark Jr., who his family had made a fortune in sugar. He actually lived on Long Island and was an avid automobile collector, founder of the Long Island Automobile Museum, and naturally enough, very interested in the Vanderbilt Cup, given where he grew up and lived. And he collected many of the photos in this presentation. And many years later, 1990, 1991, he donated the bulk of his collection to the Henry Ford Museum. So that's why I'm able to share those with you today. But his legacy lives on, in addition to Joe Tracy's and Peter Helk's for that matter. Another great shot here. This is Joe Tracy a few years earlier in 1908 with Willie Kay there. Certainly two of the biggest names to come out of the Vanderbilt Cup. And what of Old 16? Well, Peter Helk passed away in 1988, and Old 16 at that point passed on to his son Jerry. And then Jerry Helk, a few years later, was able to arrange a sale of the car to the Henry Ford. We got it from him in 1997. We have held it since then, and it has been on display pretty much continuously from that time, often spotlighted in whatever racing exhibit or presentation we have it included in. But this is a photo of what it looked like. I remember seeing it like this as a visitor at Henry Ford Museum all those years ago, set up here with a beautiful panoramic backdrop there. You see mannequins there riding the car or driving the car, photos on the screens in the background. A pennant, some souvenirs, a face mask worn by Joe Tracy, which is still in the collection. I will say one of the creepiest things in the collection. Every time I pull the drawer with that in there, I have to jump back a little bit. But also kind of noteworthy here, you see we did indeed borrow the Vanderbilt Cup for a couple of years there. So it's on display as well. At the time, this was put in 1997. And my hat's off to the exhibit designer. They actually made proper flags of the period. So this is an Italian flag from 1908, which has this cross in the middle. Looks a little different than the Italian flag as you think of it today, and for that matter, the German flag different at that time as well. And yes, the American flag has the prerequisite 48 stars. Well, I guess it would have been 46 stars at that time. So we've had some famous visitors who've come to see Old 16 as well. This is Mr. Cool himself, Paul Newman, leaning on the back tire. Normally we don't let people touch the cars at the museum, but when you're Paul Newman, you can touch whatever you want, I guess. So who's going to say no to the Sundance Kid? Or excuse me, Butch Cassidy. He's not the Sundance Kid. We were delighted last year to be invited to bring Old 16 out to Pebble Beach, which has been its second visit out there since we have owned it. I think we had the car out there in 2008 for the centennial of its win in 1908, and then last year they did a special class of Vanderbilt era cars. You can see the sign there, and we we had the prime spot there on the corner and right there along the waterfront. So absolute thrill to be there with the car, and also just satisfying when we bring cars like that out to big events like this, because folks come, they know the car's history already, they know its story, they know its significance, so you get a sense that it is special to be able to share that with folks who can't come to see us. We'll bring it out to them in Pebble Beach. So a couple of resources if you're interested, and much of the data I got in terms of speed and finishing times, course links, etc., came off of this phenomenal website here, Vanderbilt Cup Races. It's basically a blog that's not updated daily. I would say every week or two there's a new update on there, but it's everything from videos, interviews with folks who, well, in some cases, interviews with folks who had driven in the original Vanderbilt Cup, obviously filmed many, many years ago, but put up now, or with modern historians who've looked at the Vanderbilt Cup. There are also stories about some of the drivers, not just the famous ones like Joe Tracy or George Robertson, but even some of the obscure folks, if I can use that term. And also just general stories about racing history in the United States, early racing history especially. One of my favorite sections on the website, though, which gets updated fairly often, the producer of this page will go out and take photos of the race locations today as they appear, and then compare them to how they looked in 1906, 1908, you name it. He's got a few shots of the Jericho Turn. He's got some shots of sections of the original Long Island Motor Parkway, which have been long since abandoned. Now they're just in the back of someone's backyard or something, but you can still see the original cement surface down there, so that's always interesting. Even a couple of the churches and hotels that show up in some of the early photos still survive. He's got photos of those too, so well worth your time, but I'll warn you, it is a rabbit hole. You'll go there, you'll tend to spend a couple of minutes. A few hours later, you'll find, wow, that was interesting. Also, and this is kind of fun, when we put in Old 16 in the museum in 1997, we put together a short film about its victory in 1908, about the Vanderbilt Cup generally. And not coincidentally, Paul Newman narrated the story for us. Very kind of him to do that. And the video is no longer on the museum floor, unfortunately, but you can still see it if you go to Vimeo and follow this specific link. You can watch it there. And that is Old 16, actually driving out in the back of Greenfield Village, so we restaged it on a short path of portion of our own property there. But fun fact, the fellow with the checkered flag there is Bob Casey, who's my predecessor as Curator of Transportation. So he likes to joke that he's just like Robert Redford. He's done films with Paul Newman too. So. But a terrific fellow anyway. But anyhow, that's a kind of a brief history of the Vanderbilt Cup. As I say, you're welcome to visit that webpage. You can visit our own webpage for the Henry Ford too, thehenryford.org/collections. That will bring you to our digitized collections where you can look at some of the original photo albums. I've just showed you 2 or 3 pictures, say, from 1905. Those might have come from a 20 or 30 page photo album from Henry Austin Clark. So you go online, you can see the whole photo album, see everything in there. So that's well worth your time as well. But I don't know if there are any questions I can answer just about the race generally, or maybe about the museum generally. I'd be happy to do that. I think Andy's going to work the floor there with the microphone.
Yes, any questions for Mr. Anders?
Different by design. Studebaker is. Studebaker